Today we're going to visit Cascade Locks and look into what this massive ancient landslide did to Cascade Locks. The Columbia River flows right through Cascade Locks, and at one time there was a massive landslide that Lewis and Clark noted it on their records, that they found dead trees and things where there had been a big lake right above where Cascade Locks now sits. And the Indians told a story about you could walk across the Columbia River on this massive dam the landslide built up and never get your feet wet. The Columbia River eventually reclaimed itself and washed a bunch of this landslide out to where there was no longer a lake, but it did leave some big boulders which were very bad rapids that you couldn't take a boat through. So Lewis and Clark noted that they had to portage for about 5 miles around Cascade Locks to once again get in the river and start going down. Locks were at one time installed here to get boats around these rapids. After Bonneville Dam was constructed, these locks were no longer needed for navigation around the rapids because of the build-up water. The boats could go out in the main channel and go right on through. So it was much history happened here, and so there are a few historical museums. There's even a shed here that's got a bunch of old farm equipment and different other historical things, as well as a nice museum. We would have gone in the museum, but it's closed for the season right now. Will be open again in the summer. There are even campgrounds here where if you choose, you can camp, and this one even has a camp host that is here, although we didn't see anybody out and around.
Campground, Marine Park Campground. Well, this is their campground. Cascade Locks. And there's the Bridge of Gods.
There was never a natural bridge across the Columbia River. The natives could cross on the debris from the landslide.
This is their port office.
We drive past the port offices and follow the road as it winds down to where the old locks once were.
Wow, there's nobody down here right now. And they used to have the sidewalks clear full when you went fishing for steelhead. Park hours, 1/2 hour before sunrise until 10 p.m.
What does it say about the rest?
They're closed. This is where we used to go steelhead fishing. Some of the favorite spots were right across on the end to the left. And there's the Bridge of Gods.
Now it's the old locks here at Cascade Locks, where they built this before Bonneville Dam was built to get boats around the rapids that were down here. There were big rocks and rapids on the other side of this berm, and so then they built the locks to to improve shipping through here. And now the locks are used by fishermen, just sport fishermen, who make little pole holders and set them up here on the sidewalk. And it used to be, we did this in the 1980s and 90s and caught a lot of steelhead here. And these areas were totally full of people when the steelhead were biting, fishing. And this rickety platform right here was built by the Indians fishing on with their tribal rights, and a person isn't supposed, those are private property of the Indians, and you're not even supposed to set foot on it. It looks a little rickety anyway. There's one on the other side over there, and they have nets. They catch salmon in here and steelhead or whatever's in. And here's where the disabled fishermen could set their poles up, and there are even some pole holders here for them to put their fish poles in. Looks like a favorite place of ducks, and there's an old goose came in with them. And there's the boat launching site was used by the people, the Native Americans with the tribal rights, where they could launch their boats when they were gill netting. There's a gill netting season for the tribal people here, and also some sport fishermen might choose to launch. They've put life rings up here in case someone falls in the river. You can throw them one of them. And we used to fish right over across there. We'd set a pole holder up and weight it down either with a bucket of rocks with rocks or a bucket of water, and fish right in the river there with spinners.
On the other side.
Yeah. When we fished here, this place was crowded, a beehive of activity, and people hollering, "Fish on!" As I walk across the bridge, I remember some of the old Indians that became friends of ours that used to net fish here. They'd crawl down those rickety ladders and spend the whole day on these platforms and catch enough fish to feed their family. I don't think they were allowed to sell any of the fish they caught in these dip nets from these platforms. They were just for their own use, but they did have a gill net season, and on this gill net season they were able to sell their fish. So if you get to Cascade Locks at the right time, you might be able to buy a fish there. They set up a truck with a tank and ice and fish to sell to people that might want to buy fish. And it seems to me like they were selling them at a pretty reasonable price. And a lot of people from Portland would come up here and buy a salmon if they didn't want to go fishing for them. Out of all the times we went fishing here, I never did know of one of the Indians to fall off one of these platforms or into the river. but the old men that fished along, just the general public that fished along these sidewalks, occasionally one of them would fall in. They were quite old, but somebody'd take a fish net and net them and pull them up to shore and get them back up and get them dried out again. They'd set their poles in a pole holder and let it fish, and then when a fish got on, they'd hurry over and get it. Otherwise, they'd continue on their gossiping. The sturgeon seen here is my granddaughter and I holding it up, and I caught it right across the river here. A nice big one, and it was sure good eating. This island is called Thunder Island. This looks to be a walkway where they could pull, maybe they had some function, I'm not sure what, maybe to pull the boats through the locks. This is where you could get married if you wanted to, and it looks like some geese found this a good place to hang out. Maybe they're figuring on getting married. It's kind of like getting married for geese. They're another animal that mates for a lifetime. There's a bunch of rocks fell right over here, and there's some big rocks out in the river, but that's where the rapids were before Bonneville Dam was built. And all these rocks and debris that's in the river came from this mountain right up here, where the mountain literally split in half, and half of it rolled down and came right here into the river that made these big boulders, which are still here, and the big landslide. You can sure see where that landslide rolled down right here into the river, and this is about the summit of the Cascade Mountains. And the river actually was here before the Cascade Mountains were pushed up, and so that's why they go through what is almost the summit of the Cascade Mountains. The locks are no longer used because the backwaters of the Bonneville Dam have backed up here and covered the big rocks that slid in here. And the rapids. And those geese seem to like this nice still water to go out there and get them a drink and swim in a little bit. There's even some giant old cherry trees growing here. I can see the seeds from them on the ground right in front of me, and they're really huge old cherry trees. It is pretty much all a park. If it wasn't that it's like January here, there'd probably be a lot of people out doing things. There still are a few, and this was the old channel that the old boats went up when they wanted to go through the locks. And the last I was here, there was a paddle wheeler boat tied up over there, and you could go on a ride on it. It was a huge boat, and you could go on a ride on it for a few dollars. I assume that it's still here in the summertime. It was a big paddle wheeler. I was fishing for sturgeon right off that wall back in the 80s, and that's where I caught a really nice big sturgeon. There's another ramp that goes down to the water's edge. I just wonder if maybe that was where they would hook on to boats to pull them through the locks. And here's what they call the Red Bluffs wedding site. These ramps are lined up right straight across from each other. And the Bridge of the Gods is there, and you can still cross it. It's a toll bridge, and I think it's maybe $1 still to cross it. I'm not sure of that. It may be more now. The old stairways are still here, and you can still walk up them. They were built very well.
Welcome to Port of Cascade Locks.
There's a marina. It looks like it's mostly sailboats.
Yeah.
There's nice lawns and nice parks with lots of facilities here right along the waterfront at Cascade Locks. And in the summertime, there's a lot of people use this. They have different conventions there, like rock hounds and even antique car shows and stuff there. There's even a sculpture of a mountain lion climbing down a rock.
And there's their pavilion. It's a pretty big pavilion. Look at that neat little playground they have up here for kids.
The Cascade Mountains rise steeply above this spot, since this is about the summit of the Cascade Mountains through here. And the Columbia River was supposedly here before the Cascade Mountains. So that's why it was able to go through the gorge.
The history of the Columbia River Gorge goes back 30 million years through ages of lava, ice, and tectonic activity. Around 12,000 to 15,000 years ago, a series of great floods occurred. As ice sheets advanced into Canada and northern Washington, gigantic ice dams were formed. When these dams broke, huge amounts of water were unleashed. The most recent and possibly the greatest dam retained a 3,000 square mile lake extending 250 miles into Montana. When the dam gave way, an estimated 380 cubic miles of water poured out during a water during a 40-hour period, known as the Brett's Flood. It spread water over 16,000 miles of central Washington before pouring into the Columbia River. It's scoured out the Columbia River Valley to a depth of 1,200 feet at Walupa Gap, that was Walula Gap, exposing towering basalt cliffs. At Crown Point, water reached a depth of 600 feet.
Okay, this one here now.
The most recent natural catastrophe helping shape the present-day Columbia River Gorge was a huge landslide called the Cascade Slide, which occurred about 700 years ago. The slide covered an area of about 5.5 square miles, damming the Columbia River. The river was dammed long enough to give rise to the Indian legend of the Bridge of Gods. When the dam washed out, it left rapids called the Cascades of Columbia, which were impassable by boat. The backed up waters of the 300-foot lake created by the Cascade Slide drowned the forests on the banks upriver. Lewis and Clark reported. What is, however, most singular is that there are stumps of pine trees scattered for some distance in the river, which has the appearance of being dammed below and forced to encroach on the shore. Remnants of the forest could be seen at low water before both rapids and the tree snags were submerged behind the waters of Bonneville Dam in 1938. That should do it.
Okay, now
Okay,
let's see if we can get a picture of
Okay,
this.
let's see.
There's the tree stumps.
Each year in early June, no work could be done during the dry summer months. Each year at the beginning of the flood season, all of the equipment had to be removed and then repositioned after the flood was over. Work resumed in the fall, but was hampered by heavy rainfall and frequent snows. Workers were cumbersome oilskin coats and awkward boots, slowing their efforts greatly. Funds were slow in coming, and in 1888, Major Hanbury noted that a generation will have been born and gone to its grave between the beginning and ending of this enterprise. At last, after the flood damage of 1894 was repaired, the canal was opened in 1896. $3.8 million had been expended, but the cost of human toil far exceeded any dollar amount, given the isolated and extreme nature of the site. Otherwise, mundane project statistics are staggering. The Columbia River Gorge forms the only natural break through the Cascade Mountains between California and Canada. For many years, this was the main route for Indian and white man alike, passing between the interior of the country and the Pacific coast. However, this highway of water was blocked by the Cascade Rapids, requiring an arduous 4.5-mile portage. For centuries, travelers sought to overcome this obstacle. Native Americans had ancient footpaths on both sides of the river. Those were used by Lewis and Clark in their expedition of 1804 to 1806. Lewis wrote on their trip in 1806, "This portage is 2,800 yards along a narrow, rough, and slippery road at present. The whole distance is extremely difficult of ascent. After rafting the untamed Columbia River from Fort Dallas, the first pioneers found a nearly impassable barrier at the Cascades Rapids. The rutted wagon track around the torrent was little more than a wide footpath." The Cascades of the Columbia have been an Indian fishing site since the great landslide over 700 years ago. The Indians of the area were probably of the Chinook tribe. Lewis and Clark call them the Wasilalaws and noted that they were very often blind, but known not what caused to attribute the prevalent deficiency of the eye, except it was their exposure to the reflection of the sun on the water, to which they are constantly exposed in occupation of fishing. They, as was the custom of many Indians of the Northwest, flattened the foreheads of the infants and were commonly called flatheads. They lived in houses made of cedar, traveled in wonderfully crafted canoes, and fished off the rocks with spears and nets. Between 1829 and 1832, the Indian population was decimated by a disease commonly thought to be malaria. Consequently, they could offer only resistance when the pioneers began to appropriate their lands. The Indian myth of Tamaha, or the Bridge of the Gods, is based on the archaeological evidence of a great landslide which blocked the river for a short time. One version of the Indian story tells of Coyote who asked the Great Spirit for a tunnel under the landslide so that salmon could come up the river and feed his people. For many years the salmon came and Coyote's people crossed over Tamana by foot and traveled under by canoe on peaceful waters. Eventually, two princesses of the tribe, East and Klickitat, became rebels for the love of Loo-Wit, a beautiful maiden. Those were rivals for the love of Loo-Wit and a beautiful maiden. They caused so much trouble and strife among the people that the Great Spirit turned them into mountains. East became Mount Hood, and Klickitat became Mount Adams, and Loo-Wit was changed into beautiful Mount St. Helens. Even after becoming mountains, they continue their fight, throwing white hot ashes at each other and shaking the earth. Finally, so many stones landed on Tamana, they shook the earth so hard the great ark broke and fell into the river.
Okay, now what's this?
For centuries, Native Americans have fished at the great cascades of the Columbia River. Today, Native Americans of Yakima, Umatilla, Warm Springs, and Nez Perce tribes have in lieu fishing rights at Cascade Locks. They continue to fish with nets, often from platforms built much like those their ancestors used. The Great Cascade landslide, which occurred around 1260 AD, dammed the Columbia River, creating the Indians' Bridge of the Gods. An Indian legend tells of being able to cross the river with dry moccasins. With or without the Bridge of the Gods, Native Americans have been crossing the Columbia River for centuries using cedar canoes. They crossed in the slack waters above the rapids. Later, as the river became an east-west travel route, it was necessary to portage around the rapids, a distance of about 5 miles. Portage railroads were built on both sides of the river, and settlements grew around the landings. When the OSN company acquired both portage lines, the Oregon route was used exclusively for a short time until the easier to maintain Washington route could be lengthened and rebuilt. With settlements on both sides of the river, crossing by rowboat above the rapids became a perilous adventure. Small steam-powered ferries later carried passengers and goods between the town of Cascade Locks, Oregon, and Stevenson, Washington.
Okay, now this one.
In 1926, a privately owned company, the Wanna Toll Bridge Company, built a bridge across the narrowest portion of the gorge at the west end of Cascade Locks. A 50-cent toll was charged to cross the man-made Bridge of Gods. In 1938, the bridge was raised 36 feet to allow clearance above the reservoir created by Bonneville Dam. Today, the Bridge of the Gods is owned by the Port of Cascade Locks, and the toll is still only 50 cents.
Well, I think that's wrong. I think it's $1
I think it's
now.
$1 now too.